wanted to start with something I've been thinking about, and I've called it, in creating this slide, I called it School in 2020. And I've been looking at I've been, engaging with the media in the last 2 months since we've been in lockdown and schools have been closed and things have been happening. And I guess my lens for which I'm looking at particularly things that are coming through in the media are as a teacher educator, as somebody who's worked in schools, various schools in different states in Australia, as a mother who now has teenage children, as somebody who loves online teaching and learning and thinks it really has a place, and does a lot of that in the higher education sector. So what I've found, and what I'm starting to do, is a bit of a discourse analysis actually of this, these media reports. And so I've presented a few of them for you here, and I'm sure everybody has an opinion, whether they've been horrified at some of the things that have been said or whether they've agreed with them. And I looked at who we've got here in the room with us today, and it looked like mostly people from the university, but hopefully there's a few of you who are also who are teachers in schools, because I would actually really love some feedback from people, and maybe that could be put into the Q&A section. The thing that I found most interesting is the way that Scott Morrison in particular has been championing schools, but also championing them as that's the best place for kids to learn. And so to me, this has really opened up this idea of what learning is, what it looks like, and what the role of the teacher is. And so I think as teachers, we've all felt kind of like, oh yeah, we're really important. Of course, that's where kids learn. But I think as teachers, we also know that kids do learn in other ways and in other places. So I found it quite disturbing. I found it disturbing that he's continued to talk about, and I put this one quote here, which was actually when he was talking to Alan Jones. So really very mainstream, but he's put it in his press releases as well. The idea that educational needs of children are best served by having children in the classroom. I'm just going to actually leave that one with you, because I'm going to now take you to a quote that's actually from my daughter, who's a year 11 student. And she said, oh, you know what, Mum? They've taken all the good stuff away and they've left us with the teacher. It's like, okay, so as teachers, we're like, okay, is this how kids are feeling about this? And this is taking the good stuff away. For her, it was, they've cancelled cross country. They've cancelled, can't go on camp. When they weren't going to school, they couldn't see their friends. And so the stuff that's the fabric of school and being together in that space was being removed. But we still, the kids still had the teacher, and very much the teacher is, and again, depending on whether it became very online or whether it was more as a remote type of teaching and learning experience. But the teacher became very central, particularly to the way that my children were continuing to be taught. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of slides' time. So I'm going to leave that thought, particularly with the teachers, which I think you all are teachers and all have a sense of what that is. That yes, this was a thing that my daughter actually thought she could do without the teacher. She really wanted the other stuff back, and she actually was learning okay without having to turn up and be there with the teacher. So anyway, the other little points I've put here that I'll just have a moment with as well. Neil Selwyn, who's a professor and who writes about education, and you may have seen him. He turns up in this was in the Sydney Morning Herald, so he turns up in sort of the mainstream media as well. But he put that, and I think this is something that we've all become very much aware of, is that by closing the school, we've actually taken away, and it's not just cross country and camps and things like that, but we've taken away, or we did, because now obviously we've opened schools again, we took away the things to do with, say, subsidised food, mental health support, and respite from unsatisfactory circumstances from home. And I feel like over the discourse of the last 2 months maybe didn't really pull that out enough in terms of how important those the spaces of the school actually is for a lot of those kids. So a lot of talk came about online learning. I think a lot of kids weren't in online learning as we now understand it in the university. And I think just shifting into this sense of we're just going to now start doing school in a different, but just in a different space, meant that we hadn't really covered some of these other things that happen in school for a lot of these kids. The last quote there, and on my two little pictures, that actually maybe it was because, you know, it's all this, okay, we've got to get back to the classroom. Some of the what's happened, and for those of you who are teachers in schools and have experienced this, you'll know that there's kids who actually it's worked very well for them. And there's this, so there's a side to how's it shifted what it means to be in a teaching and learning relationship with your students, and what can it actually, how can it support some of those kids who maybe don't do school so well. And so hopefully I'm really interested in it's going to happen in the next 6 months and 12 months, and looking back on this time, what's come out of this. So what we've managed to, what are the good bits that we've kept, and what are the things that it's highlighted for us in terms of what the physical classroom, physical school means to us. Before I move on to my next slide, I just point to my two images. I went looking for something, and yesterday there was Anastasia Palaszczuk's Twitter post to do with kids going back to school. And again, I just felt like this was this represents to them what the right thing is, and it's kids on their bikes and kids in the uniforms. And she was going off to meet them at the Milton State School as well. So the imagery that we're getting and the text in the media through this time, I think, is very much brought forth different ideas around school and education and teaching and learning. So something that so as a teacher educator who's also interested in doing research around this, something I'm doing at the moment is picking through some of these things that are being said and trying to kind of work out what this discourse has been during this time. So I'm really interested if people have got their own opinions. Let's go to the next one. Okay. So to skip to, so that was, I sort of put school in 2020, which I think is really, you know, I think what's our lived experience at the moment. University in 2020, so university has been flipped for a lot of people as well. Now for me, I just went, no, that's okay, I teach online. Things were pretty much the same. But for my husband, who is Dr. Matt Hill, who works in music, his music course at SCU is completely on campus. Everything they do is on campus. And so for me, he's been a really nice example for the on-campus switch to online, because he's had to take something that was completely on campus to completely online. And most of us who work in the School of Education actually do work partly online and partly on campus. So it wasn't such a big kind of shift for us. And so this has kind of taught me a few things that I wanted to share with everybody, because I think they're useful ideas. My lessons learned, I'll just go through those. So I think what became really important was actually believing that you can do it. And I'm hoping that those of you who are here listening and in the future listening to this recording will think about that and reflect on this now. So when did it work and when didn't it work? And I think starting with actually thinking you can do it is really important. And some people probably thought that they couldn't, but actually had to, because that was the situation that we were in at that time and that we were in. But I think it makes it a lot easier if you think that you can, even if you don't know how you're going to get there. And that's when you need to bring in people to help you. You also need to have a willingness to actually solve those problems. So actually just saying, no, it can't happen, it kind of goes back to the belief, is not going to get you anywhere. Having the access to the technology. Now, a lot of people in schools working with kids didn't even have that access to the technology. So the idea of being online, as I said, you know, there's a lot of talk about it being online, when really what it was remote. It was remote learning. It wasn't homeschool. I know what homeschool looks like. I've been a homeschool parent myself. It's a different thing again. And having an expert buddy. So I actually think that that's the one thing that really Matt would tell you that he had his expert, which was me, who kind of was able to stand off camera and go, oh, maybe if you press that button now and if you do that there. But I only had to do that the once, and then he was fine. He went ahead with it. So I think I can't really overstate how much having a bit of a mentor or an expert or somebody who helps you, but doesn't, who works alongside you. And so working with you in a way that works for your pace, but also helps you in that time. And my tips. So this is what I try and talk to people about who, when people aren't sure about how to go about online, getting online, how do we do this? You need to start with what you actually do now, and then think about why you do that. So what's the learning? What are the things you want the students to learn? Not what do you think you want to do with them in the class, or what you think is interesting to you, or what you think is the amazing amount of content that you want to give them, but what is the thing you want them to learn by doing that thing that you've put in place. And then when you've identified that, then you can look around you for whatever those tools are that you have and say, how are we going to use those tools now, which are different from what we had before. And my example with Matt is he wanted to show, and you can see in the picture, he wanted to show students the keys on his keyboard, because that's what he does when they're in the room with him. It's not very practical with a camera attached to the computer. And so we thought, oh, you need a webcam. We didn't have a webcam. It was locked in my office in Lismore. So oh, surely our phones will do this. We did a little bit of Googling. We discovered there was a nice little app that he could use, and he set his phone up above his keyboard, which he can actually move around as well. And he can sometimes he puts a textbook under there, because that's the sort of thing he does with his students. And he said to me, he's actually going to keep using this in the classroom on campus, because actually now his students can see his hands better than they could before when they were looking at him from the side. Okay. I'm finding it's a bit funny that I'm not getting any feedback as we go along, so I'll go to my next slide. Here we go. Oh, hang on. Sorry, I have to go back. All right. So what's happened here? So something that's happened in the university and that's happened with schools is what we've got is what I'm calling the accidental online student, or the accidental remote student. Because when in the university setting, most of the time, a student will choose to be an online student. So they come with certain expectations. They come with their access to technology because they've made a decision to be an online student. And they have all these other things sort of sorted out in order for them to be that online student. But what's happened is that all of our students have been told they have to be online now. So they've been accidental online students. So they don't have these sorts of things already set up in place. And this is what's happened with the schools as well. So the kids didn't expect, and the parents didn't expect their kids to be having to learn remotely or online. They didn't make that choice. But all of a sudden that they've had to deal with this. So here are the things that we've now had to consider. So the images I've got on, the text I've got on the right is really around what we need to think about when we're designing the learning for these students. And one of the reason I've chosen the image in the middle was because sometimes, and this is mostly more with adult students, our accidental online students might only have a phone if they've got that. That might be the only technology. So how are we connecting with them in their learning through something other than what we might imagine as a more complex system of technology? And I guess the reason I bring this up as part of a school environment too is understanding what your students actually have and what that access is to, whether it's technology or not technology. And that's things that everybody's had to grapple with in a really big way. You'll have to tell me how I'm going for time, Megan, because I've forgotten where I'm up to.
You're okay. You've got a few more minutes, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. On the left, I wanted to raise for us the idea about replicating school, because I think that's a really big issue. I think that's really something that's happened over this time. I think that teachers, I think that school systems have decided that the best thing to do was to actually try and make it as normal as possible for students. And so what has happened this is from me talking to teachers and principals and people around who are having to do this. Timetables were kept. Kids had to turn up to Google Meets, 5 Google Meets a day, for example, for some kids. so this is the sort of contact hours. You know, do we need the kids to be there with the teacher? So go back to what my child said. Do we need them to be with the teacher all that time? And in the online space, and I argue the remote space, that's not necessary. So if we shift our thinking away from kids do the learning when they're in the classroom with the teacher to actually kids can learn in all sorts of different ways. Maybe we just need to set them on some interesting paths and they'll find out all sorts of things and then they can come back to us. So that means breaking the timetable. And I actually suggested that to a deputy principal I was talking to, and I saw the look on his face of like, oh no, I've got my timetable. I can't go changing the timetable. So if we were going further, if we were still in lockdown and our kids were still at home, I actually think these are some of the questions we'd be having to really ask ourselves in terms of moving forward, because I think keeping the kids in the very structured, making it look like school to feel like as normal as it possible, just that was beginning to, I think we're beginning to see the cracks in that. And that was what we were starting to see with our parents as well, and the cracks in that. And if I'm at the end of my 15 minutes, which I probably am, I put a quote here that said, all leaders agreed that children should go to school tomorrow. This was actually very early on. And that children cannot lose an entire year of their education. And that again gets back to that discourse around really, like, the belief that by children not being in school, somehow they were going to be seriously disadvantaged in terms of what they were learning. So actually that then created a tension, which was about, well, we've got to keep doing school because it's school that's causing this. If we don't have school, then we don't have the learning. So do you want me to wrap up?
Yeah, sure.
Or I got another minute?
You've got a minute. If you got it, one more thing to do, go for it.
I'll just give you my slides so everybody can just have a look at it. Because if we were all going into, if we were in online learning still or in remote learning still, this would probably be more relevant for us than now that we've shifted back into being at school. But I think it's, to me, I presented this to the university sector as ways to elevate their online teaching. And I felt that in thinking about it, I felt that these translated equally into a school setting as sort of 5 key ideas. So maybe I'll just leave people with my 5 key ideas and they can go away and think about it.